And I'm going to talk about that today, or at least try, because I have only 20 minutes. So we know that many students, they just enter our schools with limited knowledge of the language of the school, especially in the Netherlands. They come, they have no Dutch. And when we received the funds to start EDINA, the Netherlands and Europe in its entirety were in crisis. You remember? We called it the refugee crisis. And today it is clear that this so-called crisis has become a long reality, right? You agree with me? Students continue to arrive in our classrooms in large numbers with rich language repertoires, different levels of school language, different levels of schooling at different ages with complicated backgrounds, having so often spent a year here, a year there, without necessarily having benefited from school continuity. So here we are. So I think we cannot talk about a crisis. We really need to talk about a long-term pedagogy that has become our new reality. So when I was reflecting on that question, I thought, you know, I believe that in education, we are a bit in a dead-end street, right? In French, we say un cul-de-sac. In fact, I saw that word also in Ireland. And what do you do when you are in a dead-end street? What do you do? Yeah, exactly, you turn back. And the only way is to turn back. That is to say, you don't change your final objectives. And our final objectives are to include these students as soon as possible to the classroom, right? But what you change is the road to get there. So in fact, you need to reorient your GPS. You agree with me? And find a way out of this dead-end street. So you need to take into account this obstruction that prevents you from moving forward. So the question today is really this one. How can we reorient on the long term? It's not on the short term because we are not in a crisis. It's a long reality. Our GPS when we talk about students, assessment, evaluation, and ultimately inclusion. So what I'm going to do, because I have very little time, I was given 20 minutes, I'm going to take 3 very concrete examples that I have from experiences I had in the different projects I had around the world, and try to get a lesson out of it. What I think is essential we take into account, a kind of take-home message. So this is my first example. I'm not sure you can read well on the screen, can you? Is it far away? Can you read? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to read with you anyways, but John is a 6th grade teacher of 11, 12 years old at a school in Canada. And all of his students are plurilingual, multilingual, bilingual, whatever, how you want to call them. And 10% of them arrived in Canada within the last 5 years. The students have mastered the language of the school, English, to varying degrees, from basic, intermediate to expert level. So you need to know that in Canada, at primary school level, all students are directly integrated to the regular schools. 2 of his students had been assessed in math at the beginning of the year. And for that particular topic, which is math, they were oriented towards grade 3, which means that every time they would do math, the students were pulled out and sent to a grade 3 class. Okay, they were in grade 6. So it's groep 8 versus groep 5, right? So one day I came for the research, I was in the classroom, and because I wanted to observe the implementation of an online resource we work with that is called Binogi. So are you familiar with Binogi? No. So Binogi is an online resource. What you have is videos in there, and videos of 5 to 7 minutes that kind of summarize the lesson with animations. And the particularity of, and it's aligned to the curriculum, of course. So you would have electricity, statistics, whatever you study in school. And the particularity of Binogi is that the students can change the language of the video from the language of the school, which is here English or French, to Arabic, Dari, Somali, Tigrinya, and even Ukrainian or Russian, right? They can also view the subtitles in the language of the school or in one or the other languages. They can slow down the speed, they can speed up the tempo, they can rewatch the video, and they can read the transcript placed below the video in case they would like to translate themselves in a Google Translate or with a software, whatever. So it's a very useful resource that I recommend you look at. And on that day, these two students who usually did mathematics with grade 3 were in the classroom. So the teacher said, whatever, we are going to do math all together. So we gave the tablets to everyone. They chose to work in Arabic. They watched the video in Arabic. And after the video, they did the quiz in Arabic, written quiz. And to our surprise, all of a sudden, we noticed that these students were able to answer the quiz correctly in Arabic. And at that point, we realized, and the teacher was even more shocked than I was, that these students were in fact perfectly able to do math at grade 6 level, but that only the language was in the way. So what is super interesting is that in this example, a simple translation of the test into the student's primary language allowed the school to repair what was a potentially serious orientation error, right? I think I was in that class in February and the students entered the classroom in September. So you can imagine they were already doing for 6 months math with the grade 3. So of course, the teacher took the necessary administrative measures to reintegrate them into his mathematics class. So I think this is really the basis, right? Include the languages of your students in your teaching. And not only once, systematically. It should be always available. Students should be encouraged to switch constantly to their own language, to go back and forth, to try to understand even better and communicate even better whatever they need to. That's the first point. My second example. So for the first Edina project, and Marie and Sergio will probably remember this example, one day we met a student who told us, I love my school, but the problem is that I'm redoing everything I already know. And it was interesting because the teacher had presented her as an extremely bright student. And of course, they were super happy because she worked very well in the class she was in. But what they didn't realize is that these students might have been able to go to the next level because she already knew the program. So very often we are very happy that we discover that students are able to do what we expect them to do at an age appropriate level for our own system. The problem is that some countries are ahead of us in their curriculum, and their students have already done what we suggest they do in the levels indicated, right? And that we don't expect, right? So in part of our project, what we have done, we have compared the curricula of different countries to the curriculum of my province here in Canada, which is Ontario. And I'm giving you here an example. So you have, it's an example for science. So for grade 6, which would be groep 8. And you see the difference right away, right? While the Syrian curriculum focuses more on the body of knowledge, as evidenced by the number and variation of topics covered at each level, the Ontario curriculum focuses on the acquisition of 4 categories of science knowledge and skills with the very clear assessment criteria for each. knowledge and understanding, thinking and investigation, communication, and application, which are not explicitly identified in the Syrian curriculum. What it means is that assessments often include performance criteria that assess much more than just content knowledge. There are other skills that are assumed to be present more or less universally, but that in fact are not, are maybe absent from the curriculum of the country where students previously attended school. So if you try to assess these skills in the language of the school or even in the language of the students, it may become difficult for them to do it because they don't know how, they haven't learned how. So here we are talking about the pedagogy, right? And it may lead you to an underestimation of the students' academic achievements and skills too, right? So I would say the second strategy, get informed about their program of study and compare. It is essential to take that into account. Before being assessed, students must have the opportunity to learn and understand the expectation of the systems in question with regard to assessment and to be trained in these new assessment forms. So before you assess a student, make sure you train that student for that assessment. And then the third one, at the end of last year, so that's very recent, we held a meeting with the students participating in our project, and one of the students told us, and those are secondary school students, newly arrived, just newly arrived. My problem with math here is that I learned to solve problems differently in my country. So now I wanted to activate you a bit because I learned it was a workshop. It's the end of the day. You must be super tired. So I don't see you that well, but I will try to open my eyes even more. And my question is the following: how do you count on your fingers? Just show me. How do you count on your fingers? Right. Okay, right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Everybody the same way? Everybody the same way? Oh, is someone doing it differently? Yeah.
Yeah. Two variants at least.
Well, you are kind of a boring group.
I don't think she can see my hand. That's why.
Okay, so I can't hear everything, but let me show you. So for instance, in my team, we have a research assistant coming from China, and she right away told us, well, in China, you do it differently. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you recognize, but 6 is you need only one hand. In fact, 6 is like that, 7, 8, 9, 10. Already a difference, okay? But what is even more interesting is that some population, like often in the Middle East, but even Romania, Egypt, have known this system, this system for a very long time. So what they do is that they count the phalanges. So if you start with me, you take your thumb, you start with the little finger, and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Are there any math teachers among you? Can you raise your hand? No. Yes, 1. Yes. So what do you notice when we teach math in our countries? We teach math on a base of 10, right? 10, 100, thousands, etc. And which is what we do with the fingers. But here we have a base of 12, right? And then they continue 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. What do you think of when you think of 12 and 60? What do you think of?
5.
Yes, yes, you think of time. And indeed, it's very interesting because from this particular way of counting, we have it has had a huge influence on our life because that's the way we understand the time that passes. So 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 12 hours, 12 months even, right? So this system had a huge influence on the way we live around the world. So what I want to say with that is that each country and each province, in the case of Canada, defines learning objectives that are based on the local educational tradition and the age of its students, right? That is extremely important. What we too often forget is that curricula, they vary considerably from country to country, and even in Canada, from province to province. If you come from Quebec to Ontario, you will have to adapt to a new program of study. So if this reasoning that we just made together is correct, then we teachers, we cannot expect the same thing from a student coming from Syria, from China, or even from Alberta or Ontario or the Netherlands, right? The curricula of the countries in which the students have studied, it has to be taken into account to understand what these same students have already learned and and how they have learned it. And what and how they have learned it is valid learning. Imagine if tomorrow you go to your classroom and you ask the same question to your students. How do you count on your fingers? You know what? They will never forget your lesson. And I'm sure the only thing you will remember from what I said today is that. You will go home and tell your family, you know what I learned today? So what I want to say with that, it's not only it's valid learning, but it can, if you retrieve the knowledge of these students and these families, it might potentially enrich not only your own learning, but the learning of your class, of all of the students in the class. So it might not only help you to gain a clearer picture of the academic skills of your students, but also add to whatever and how deeply how your class and students are learning. Other facts that you might not know, but that we discovered in our research, for instance, did you know that in Syria, so it's a colleague, Dania Wata, who grew up in Syria and who discovered it because in fact she was raised differently, but she noted that in the textbook from grade 1 to grade 4, teachers use the Hindu Arabic writing of numbers. So it's this one, right? The first one. So if you test your students, newcomers, with this one, well, they won't be able to do it. Not because they cannot count, but because they don't know the representation of the numbers as such that way, right? So, and it's interesting because a couple of years ago, they would switch to grade 5 with the Latin characters. Or in fact, ironically, we call them the Arabic numbers. But what is true for Syria is not per se true for Lebanon or Syria. Each of these countries have their own rules. To that, you might add, for instance, the Arabic symbols that are replaced in grade 5 by the Latin alphabet symbols, for example, X, Y, Z in equations. And on top of that, you might add the orientation of the mathematical writing. So the equation will be written from right to left and not from left to right. So if your students are extremely slow, it's because they have to transform the sentence from left to right instead of from right to left, right? Did you think of that? So if you assess the students without knowing that, you might in fact assess something very different, right? Which is how they learned to count, not how they count, but how they learn to count. So the third strategy I want to leave you with is find out about the pedagogy and compare. Do just like I did with you. Simply ask your students, how do you count on your fingers? How do you solve an operation? In what order? You know, in the Netherlands, we do it that way. Which sign do you use for division? Which sign do you use for multiplication? Do you know? Can you write the translation for me? So why do I end up with Paulo Freire? Because I think that in many countries, and including the Netherlands, it is still not uncommon to hear teachers telling students to stop speaking their home languages. Even though I know I'm preaching in my own parish here, you don't do that. But still, it's a temptation. Because often because they don't know about multilingualism, because they don't know about the advantages on building on languages and cultures. And also because they want to do very well. They want to equip the students as soon as possible with competences in the languages of schooling, forbidding them the use of their home languages. But in fact, what we saw today is that if you do so, well, then students are not only prevented from understanding what you tell them, but also from sharing with us, with you, all they know, what we call in our jargon, their funds of knowledge. So what I believe and what I try to implement in my own research is that the teachers, you must be researchers who, with your students, you will determine the knowledge on which to build and the academic objectives in the short and long term with each of them. And together, on a case-by-case basis, you will be able to help each of your students to invest in their own learning. Research has shown again and again that allowing students to use their home language supports their learning, but also their well-being. And not doing so, in fact, is getting in the way of understanding their true capacities, is getting in the way of efficient learning, leading them to frustration, low self-esteem, and silence them. And here we come to what you were asking me to talk about, Sergio. And in some cases, even lots of school dropout, right? So Freire talked about a pedagogy that must be forged with and not forged for. So become a language-friendly school. Include the languages of your students. Find out about the pedagogy with which the students were trained. Get informed about the program of study of your students, and don't base your judgment on the results of standardized tests. And if you do so, your teaching will become truly inclusive. So I understand that it is a step-by-step, so don't be afraid. I won't leave you with, I know you have many resources on the wonderful side of Edina, and I'm sure you receive many resources extra. I just wanted to share with you a couple. I'll be happy to send them to Sergio and he'll share them with you. This is the site of our project. We work with grade 6 to 9 students, which is the equivalent of groep 8 tot, ik geloof 1, 2, 3, 4, vierde van de middelbare school, in science and math. And we have created lots of resources translated with images, as you can see, but also posters that you can print out and vocabulary booklets students can work with in the different languages, and even posters where students can add their own language, can add their own images, can add their own to define a concept. So it's called the Escape Project.ca. So don't hesitate, it's free and you can download everything that's on there, just sign up. The second one is probably one you know already, at least I know that some of you know it, the Language Friendly School. It's now a network of almost 30 schools. Many others are lining up, and what these schools do is that they support each other in becoming more language friendly. including schools, primary schools and secondary schools. At the moment in Canada, we have almost 4 schools, which is amazing. And then, of course, the wonderful resource Binogi. So for you, it would be binogi.com. It's not in Dutch yet, but I believe you receive lots of international students and all of you are fluent in English. So it could add a lot to your teaching where at least you could see how it works with those videos. You can change the language, you can add the subtitles, etc., and see the quizzes. And I want to thank you all. I want to thank especially Sergio and Marie for inviting me today. I was as surprised as honored, and I'm still very honored to talk to this very expert team of teachers. Jim Cummins likes to call them champion teachers. You are our champion teachers, and we need you because it's on you that, with you, that the change will happen. And of course, all of the students. So those are the students of a school in Toronto I visited last year. Thank you very much. So I think that the floor is open for questions.